Welcome to Backwoods Pursuit. I'm Gabe Garish, and today we're going to take a look at the question of, are image stabilized binoculars worth it? What are the pros and cons of image stabilized binoculars, and how do they fit in the optics category compared to a typical binocular that is not image stabilized? And even what about range finding binoculars? I'm going to take a look at some of the pros and cons of image stabilized binoculars, some of the reasons why you might take them out, and some of the reasons why you might not. We've been out using these for the last year or so next to regular binoculars and wanted to bring you our results and our thoughts and opinions on what they are good at and what they are not, to help you decide if they are right for you. Appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button and follow us on our social channels. All those down in the description, as well as a link to all of these image stabilized binoculars so you can check them out for yourself. Let's get started. All right, let's take a look here at image stabilized binoculars. What are they? How do they work? And really, how do they compare to typical binoculars that are not image stabilized, and even range finding binoculars? Because they are quite different. There's a lot of things you need to know about with image stabilized binoculars before you decide if there's something that you want to invest in. We've got the Kite APC binoculars, as well as the Sig Zulu6 HDX. And we have them in various configurations. We've got the 10 by 30. Kite also makes a 12 by 30, which is pretty unique. Then we have a 12 by 42 in both of them, and 16 by 42 in both of them as well. So a lot of configurations. We were able to put them all side by side and kind of see what those differences are, how they perform, and hopefully give you some valuable information here if you're looking into image stabilized binoculars. So first of all, how do they work? You take an image stabilized binocular here, and it has some electronics built into it, of course, for that stabilization, much like your camera. They've been around. Image stabilization has been around a long time in cameras, so it's just a matter of time now that they have made their way into hunting optics. Of course, there's been image stabilized binoculars out there for a while, but really have made a push into the hunting industry in recent years with Sig Zulu6 and the Zulu6 HD, and Kite Optics APC here as well. There's a few others. I think Canon makes some, but we weren't able to test those for this particular review. So you've got an image here that is bolstered by the electronics within the device to help stabilize that image like a camera. So it crops the image in just a little bit. And a part of that, the byproduct of that, is that across the board, your image stabilized binoculars are going to have a smaller field of view than a typical binocular. That's for me, one of the biggest downsides to image stabilized binoculars. For instance, your 10 by 30 in both the Sig and the Kite here is going to run a field of view just under 300 feet at 1,000 yards. So for a 10x binocular, that's pretty small. By contrast, your Zeiss SF, of course, this is a little bit more expensive binocular. You're going to be well over 350 feet at 1,000 yards for this. And then, of course, your Swarovski NL Pure here is 399 feet at 1,000 yards. So it's much, much bigger. And that's one of the biggest differences that I found, the biggest downsides, like I mentioned, of all of the image stabilized binoculars, is that field of view is reduced dramatically versus a similar pair of standard binoculars. Something to consider. The reason why that for me is important is if I'm putting a standard binocular on a tripod, which you need to do to get the most out of a standard binocular, which you don't need to do with image stabilized binoculars, is that you can have that on your tripod or even offhand, and you see a lot more. So you're able to pick up maybe a flicker of an ear or an antler or something of that nature when these are sitting there stable on a tripod, and you have a lot more area that you're looking at. So it makes it easier to pick that up. Whereas if you're using one of these, yes, you have a lot more stability, and it gives you the ability to glass offhand much, much better than a standard pair of binoculars. So that's a huge consideration with these, and makes a big, big difference. It enables you to really use these without a tripod, which is a big deal, saves a lot of weight, while not adding a ton of weight to the unit here themselves. So that makes a really big difference, but you do lose that field of view. So even if you put this on a tripod, which ASIAC Equipment makes an adapter for this, which you can put on a tripod so you can use them with or without the stabilization. which I would recommend doing if you are wanting to use these for long lasting periods. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But they have that ability, but you don't need to with the image stabilized binoculars, because you flip that on and all of a sudden you have a super stable image. You can even glass driving in a vehicle if you wanted to with these. We've done that. The stabilization is phenomenal, does an amazing job, and eliminates the need for a tripod, with some exceptions we'll talk about in a minute. Now on that note, glassing with these offhand versus glassing with a standard pair of binoculars from a tripod. The main differences there is that obviously with a standard pair of binoculars, you've got to take them out, take your tripod out, mount them on the tripod, get set up, and then start glassing. Once you're there though, I much prefer these on a tripod than I do glassing with these offhand, simply for the reason that these are not really designed with that in mind. These are designed for more of a run and gun type of a situation. And so you're hiking, you're glassing, but it gives you that stability right off the bat, and it makes it really easy to get a nice stable image. But over a long period of time, if you're sitting up on a ridge line or whatnot and glassing for a couple hours at a time, your arms get really tired holding these up for that entire period of time. So if you're going to do that, I would recommend that ASIAC Bino clamp. If you want to just leave these, and that's made for the Sig Zulus. I don't think he makes one for the Kite just yet, but that is made for those, so you could flip the stabilization off and then use these on a tripod if you wanted to do that. So just an option there, but nonetheless you are still giving up that field of view with the image stabilized binoculars, which is just a better situation with a standard pair of binoculars. So something to consider. Some of the pros and cons of the stabilization versus standard: you just don't have the ability to hold these nearly as stable and nearly as steady, particularly at some of those longer distances. You can pick up an elk or deer or whatnot a couple miles away with image stabilization, whereas you probably wouldn't be able to with this offhand because of the shake that is introduced by you holding the binocular. So that's one of the big considerations with image stabilized binoculars. So outside of field of view consideration, another thing to really consider is the overall optical quality. Now, I was actually really impressed by how good the optics were in both the Kite and the Sig. They were excellent, far better than I thought they were, given their price point, anywhere from $900 to about $1,200 for the Sig and the Kite. They were pretty close in price, Sig's being just a little bit less expensive. But either way, optical performance was pretty close. We didn't discern a huge difference there, but there was a far better performance than I anticipated. The optical performance actually I thought was pretty close to most of your $1,000 range standard binoculars. So I was very, very surprised by that and very pleased by how well they performed optically overall. Now within that, the edge-to-edge clarity of all of them was not nearly as good as a typical binocular. You do give up some edge-to-edge clarity. And one of the things that compounds is that because you have a smaller field of view with image stabilized binoculars, and then you have some compromised edge-to-edge clarity, it does make that effective use and a nice clear portion of your image a little bit less overall. But what you do see is super stable, and it's all very, very usable out to long, long distances. Now, on that note, it's kind of like your range-finding binoculars, where you give up some edge-to-edge clarity, some overall optical performance. Because of the built-in rangefinder, that's the compromises you make there, but you have the built-in rangefinder. So it's a completely different application. You can check out our big review on rangefinder binoculars and standard binoculars in the last year or two. Did more comprehensive reviews of all of that, but just things to consider if you're looking at any of these. That's a big one, the edge-to-edge clarity and the optical performance along with that field of view. Now another consideration in the optical performance category is your low light performance. Overall, again, they were pretty impressive. Both the Kite and the Sig were very, very good. The performance in low light was good, but not as good as your standard binoculars, standard non-stabilized binoculars. Again, that's assuming you have them on a tripod. Of course, the stabilization offset's a big part of that. So, but overall, as far as brightness, color contrast, and clarity in low light, the standard binoculars are going to outperform them just a little bit. But again, I was quite surprised at how good the Sig and the Kite were in low light. And of course, the higher you go in magnification, the smaller that exit pupil and the less low light performance you're going to get. But relative to a similar pair of standard binoculars, they were quite good. So there wasn't as much deviation from that as I expected there to be, which was a really nice surprise. Now, some of the areas where I personally found myself using stabilized binoculars versus not using them. That's really the question for all of us, is what situations are we going to be using them in, or would we want to take them, and when would it be better to take a standard pair of binoculars where you're putting them on a tripod, or even a range finding binocular where you need that functionality built into your binocular. So for me, what I really found was that situations where I don't particularly find myself wanting or needing to take a tripod, the SIGs and the Kites, the stabilized binoculars, were amazing for that. Something like an archery elk hunt where I'm typically not going to be glassing miles away and sitting down and glassing for long, long periods of time, because in an archery hunt, that's, at least where we hunt, that's not something that is a functionality that I need. So for those situations, the stabilized binoculars, the field of view, the smaller field of view didn't hinder all that much. And having that ability, say in a 12x or even the smaller 10x of the Kite or the Sig there, that was perfect. And you could run and gun like you a lot of times do when you're archery hunting and not have to fiddle with a tripod, save the extra weight, because as you know, packs can get pretty heavy if you do happen to harvest an elk. So that was one situation where I found it extremely useful to use. Now conversely, another time where I found like it was actually a hindrance to me was in mule deer hunting, when I'm perched on top of a ridge line and I pull this out and I really need that big field of view, and I want a super stable image though. So in those situations, I'm willing to take that tripod, put a standard pair of binoculars on a tripod, and then sit there and glass for hours, because that's a lot of times what you need to do with mule deer hunting to catch that buck moving during midday hours or early in the morning. And it just gets tiring. I found it to be very tiring just to hold these. You have to set the binocular down, let your arms rest, or prop it up on your bow or your rifle or something like that, your backpack. And so even though the stabilization was great, the problem became that my arms got really tired holding those up when I didn't have a tripod. So you could negate that and still pick up one of these and then pick up that ASIAC bino clamp and use this in that functionality. But then the limiting factor at that point is, versus something like these Zeiss or the Swaros, your field of view is grossly smaller than either of those. So if you're just watching a timber patch or a burn area or edges of an opening or whatnot, and you're wanting to catch that buck moving real sneaking through the timber or whatnot, these are going to be better for that situation, the standard binoculars, because of that bigger field of view. You can pick up movement, especially if it's perched on a tripod. So for me, that was one of the biggest situations where I felt like I really wanted the bigger field of view and the tripod there, because in a rifle hunt also, I want to have a tripod to shoot off of, so I'm going to be carrying one either way. So in that situation, I didn't feel like the stabilization was quite as beneficial, even though if I'm hiking to an area and wanting to glass, flipping that stabilization on in those situations was still a huge benefit. So if you want to buy one pair and then pick up a pair of image stabilized binoculars, but then also that ASIAC clamp, you would have the best of both worlds. But just know that you're sacrificing that field of view, which may or may not be a big deal for you, but for me it was a big enough deal that made me kind of want to lean back towards a standard pair of binoculars for those mule deer hunts. Other times that I felt myself wanting to lean towards a standard pair of binoculars is when I need that really top-notch low light performance or top-notch color contrast. Your higher end binoculars, of course, these are much more expensive. They're just going to provide that and a much better edge-to-edge clarity than the image stabilized binoculars currently provide. So that's another one of those pros and cons depending on what you are going to need them for. If good edge-to-edge clarity, phenomenal edge-to-edge clarity, and phenomenal low light performance and color contrast, image resolution, if you need and want the best of the best, your standard binoculars are going to be a better option than either range finding binoculars or image stabilized binoculars. So just keep that in mind as one of the compensating factors that for me personally made a difference in what I selected when I was out hunting. So at the end of the day, the pros and cons of your image stabilized binoculars, your standard binoculars, and then your range finding binoculars, and what's going to push you to one direction or the other. The image stabilization, both in the Sig and the Kite, was phenomenal. We're going to do another more in-depth review about these specific binoculars, so stick around for that. We're not going to get into too much of those details right now, but across the board, they were very, very good. The image stabilization is a little bit different between the two, and some of the features there is a little bit different, but it was excellent. This provides a phenomenal image on the fly. You can digiscope so much easier through these. You get your digiscoping adapter right on there, and you can just film. If you like to film or take a lot of pictures, you can do that through the binoculars very, very easy. Whereas that's a chore to hold one of these stable enough to do that without a tripod. So it's a huge benefit there. So that's, I mean, the stabilization obviously is the reason you would pick up the image stabilized binoculars. That's one of the biggest pros to them that you can get, and the lightweight. I mean, they're much lighter than well, certainly than the Swarovskis, not so much than the Zeiss SFL, but these are phenomenally lightweight for a pair of 10 by 40 binoculars. But very similar to this, you get the image stabilization with these, and you get a similar weight to that. So it's pretty phenomenal in that regard. The optical quality was excellent, much better than I anticipated for all of them. Edge clarity is not phenomenal, not that great. It's not horrible, but it's not that great. So just know that you're going to sacrifice a little bit there, and you're also going to sacrifice a little bit in the low light category, and of course that field of view is a pretty big sacrifice compared to a standard pair of binoculars. Similarly, your range-finding binoculars, you're going to give up field of view just a little bit typically. You also give up edge-to-edge clarity with range-finding binoculars and optical performance because you have that built-in rangefinder. So that's part of the overall picture of what you need out of binoculars. One final consideration is that, like range-finding binoculars, you have electronics built in to image stabilized binoculars. The electronics are what stabilize that image, just like in a camera. So because of that, your warranty is going to be different than a typical pair of binoculars. While both the Kite and the Sig image stabilized binoculars have that lifetime warranty, the electronics are not warranted for a lifetime. So something to consider, and that's very similar to range-finding binoculars. You don't typically get a lifetime warranty on the electronics. And because of that, you obviously are going to have a higher likelihood of electronics going out far before the unit itself does. So if that were to happen, you're going to have a pair of binoculars. Obviously, you can still use them, but possibly those electronics go out and you don't have the image stabilization down the road. Whereas with a typical pair of binoculars, you oftentimes can buy a nice pair of binoculars and it'll last you a lifetime if you want them to. I don't foresee that to be the case with image stabilized, but just because electronics never last as long as something that does not have electronics. So keep that in mind. They do have, again, that lifetime warranty, but the electronics are not covered by that. So I would love to hear your thoughts, your opinions. If you have any experience with these image stabilized binoculars, drop that down in the comments. Let me know what your experiences are. I'd love to hear that. Also drop any questions down there. I'd love to help you out if I can, provide any insight from our testing. And again, stay tuned for our more in-depth review of the Kite APC and the Sig Zulu6 HDX binoculars. We're going to go over those in more detail in the next video. Thanks for watching here today, and we will see you next time.